I wonder when the last time was you were caught out by the weather. The weather is so uncertain. Rain is never too far away where we are here, even as the sun pours through the window today. Sometimes you may have been caught out, though. You were caught out in it and maybe got wet yourself, or we have maybe put out clothes to dry outside and they've got wet unexpectedly. If you spend a lot of time working outside, you get a little bit better and maybe pay more attention to the weather. So if you're a farmer or a painter, you learn certain skills, I think. But even then, the weather is unpredictable. Back in 2010, just before we moved here to Waterford, we were at a Christian conference over in Croatia. And the theme of the conference was "The Lord Reigns." He is in control of all these things. And then as many of us began to hopefully make our way home from the conference, we were grounded. I was actually in Spain. The conference was in Spain, not Croatia. Because I don't know if you remember back then, but there was a volcano in Iceland that had given ash and spread it all over Europe, and it meant that there could be no flights. It was a real reminder that life is beyond our control, that food couldn't get around from place to place. And there we were being taught the lesson of the conference afterwards: the Lord reigns. Let me suggest to you that at the moment here in this country there might be a change in the temperature, a change in the weather at the moment. I wonder, do you feel it? Maybe as we look around the world today, there are stormy places, aren't there? There are storms of wars in Ukraine and the Middle East. But I sense here too there's a heating up of people and how they feel about everyday issues like housing. There's a heating up of feelings in a conversation about immigration. There's a cooling of living in a place where it's becoming increasingly difficult to make our way. The cost of living crisis is there. And when we consider the Christian faith today, I think it's fair to say that there's a cooling towards it. People are cool. But we come today to this psalm to see that even as our lives change and are uncertain, that God is in control. A challenging little comment came to, or a quote came to me this morning by Dane Ortland in his book Deeper. He says this: because God is on his throne, from heaven's perspective, everything is going as planned. That's immensely encouraging, isn't it? But it's also immensely challenging. Because when we look around our world, it doesn't look like that, yet from heaven's perspective, everything is going as planned. And Psalm 2 helps us towards that picture, because it helps us to see that God is at work in his world. He is unstoppable, setting up his king and his kingdom. We've had different kinds of psalms recently. We've spent last summer sometime in the Psalms in Book 4 of the Psalms, sometime in the autumn and around the new year. And we've had psalms of thanks, psalms of trust, psalms of lament, of history, looking at the story of God's people. And last week, a wisdom psalm in Psalm 1. But this is a different kind of psalm, because primarily it's not about us, it's about the king. This is a royal psalm. And who is this king? Well, it works on different levels. A few years ago I went to the Museum of Treasures in Waterford. When it used to be in the granary. And they had up on the wall history as it was under the street level in Waterford. So you've all these layers right the way down, because they build on top of each other. This psalm is a little bit like that. We've got the bottom layer of the psalm originally, King David. That's taken as song and scripture for God's people. But then we come up the layers and we come to King Jesus and how this psalm is true in him. And then it is taken as song and scripture by God's people across history and brings us up to the top layer, if you like, where we're standing today. The writer of this psalm You'll see it doesn't say at the top, but one of the Psalms is full of David's Psalms. And over in Acts 4:25, this psalm is quoted as a Psalm of David. It was used at the coronation of his sons as kings of Israel. And it finds fulfillment in Jesus. There are 4 different parts to it that we will explore in a moment, and 4 different voices speaking to us. But let's pause for a moment and consider where we are in this top layer today as we look around and think of kingship. We live in this country not in a monarchy. We don't have a king. It's a republic. And the president is voted for by the people. Those who are in government are elected. We live in a democracy. And we have relative peace in our country. So our nearest kingdom is the United Kingdom, if we look across that way. And yet I'm going to suggest that that's maybe not the best way that we look today, but that we look back to stories of old in history to recover what it means to be a king. Even though this country has a more mature relationship, let's say, with Britain and Great Britain than it used to, it still makes us think a little bit about being oppressed. And because we live at peace and we live in a democracy, to talk of a king sometimes gives us the idea of someone who is overpowering or overbearing or even bullying. In Ireland, we like to have quite a nice low level of authority. We don't like anyone getting too high above themselves. But let me jump you back into many times in the Bible where people were not in a democracy. They were helpless, they had little power, they had no vote, they were harassed by enemies around them. Well, in those times, what kind of king you had really mattered. And the king actually had an everyday relevance for your life. That's where we go to when we go to this psalm. In verses 1 to 3, we firstly see that God's king is opposed. We have a battle scene here, really. There's nations, there's peoples and kings and rulers who are all fighting with God. And with his anointed, verse 2. You might think of David himself when Samuel the prophet came to him and poured out oil in his head to anoint him to be king, symbolizing the pouring out of God's Spirit to enable him to do that. And we see that in the Old Testament that not only kings but prophets and priests are anointed for the role God gives them to do. But this was true especially of kings. And so when Jesus is described as the Messiah or the Christ, it means the anointed one. He is the king. But there's fighting here. Look at the commotion. There's conspiring and plotting in verse 1. And then there's this voice, verse 3, let us break their chains and throw off their shackles. Who are these enemies? Well, at David's time, they were enemies of God's people, Israel. Genesis 12, verse 2, words to Abraham in blessing a people that would come from him. God says this, that those who blesses you, I will bless. Those who curse you, I will curse. They were real enemies against Israel and against God's people. But also, we then move forward to Jesus, move up the layers, if you like. In Acts 4, we have the Church of Jesus who pray using these words after Jesus has been killed and after leaders in the church have been persecuted. And they say this in Acts 4:27, Herod Pontius Pilate met together with the Gentiles and the people of Israel in this city to conspire against your holy servant Jesus whom you anointed. And so we see that the same opposition today as people are opposed to God and his people, and persecution as we've just prayed for. But let me illustrate it for you a moment like this. I wonder if you've ever been involved in any conflicts, maybe in your work especially. Sorry for taking you there this morning. It's not a nice thing to think of, but what we find in a conflict is that it's often not just about one issue. Often, conflict comes up about one issue, but then it settles down, but then over time, it rises up over a separate issue altogether. And what we find is that it's actually people who aren't getting on with each other. It's actually the relational dynamics under the surface. There's mistrust and antagonism that endures and continue. This psalm is telling us that there is an enduring opposition in our world to God in his ways. It might come up in different times, in different ways, on different issues, but there is an enduring opposition. And we see that today sharply in the persecution of God's people across the world, people of Jesus. It's a story that's played out time and again. Eritrea, North Korea, Iran, China, Nigeria. People who in various places are intimidated and imprisoned. And even killed for their faith still today. But there is a more subtle opposition to being a follower of Jesus that we find here. Yes, we have great freedom, but you may find that people maybe treat you with a little bit of suspicion or hold you at arm's length because you're a person of Christian faith. In Ireland today, we have a culture which is seen as being progressive in its values because it has left behind traditional values of Christianity. We've had referenda on same-sex marriage and abortion, and in both of those debates before the vote, we had voices saying something very like verse 3. Let us break the chains, let us throw off the shackles of religion, really. And now when we look at some of the harm that was caused in the name of religion in the past, we can understand that, can't we? That people want to be free of all of that. That kind of religion that looks nothing like the ways of the servant King Jesus. But let's be wise as well to know that there's something in that which is an opposition to God. It's not a new thing in our world and it shouldn't surprise us. But let's also recognize where we all begin today, not just where this psalm begins. It's only by God's grace that we're not opposed to God. It's only by his grace that we might find ourselves on his side today. We found a different way. In Colossians 1:21, Paul speaks to the Christians and says, you used to be alienated. You used to be enemies of God, but now he has reconciled you. He has brought you back to himself in Jesus. God's King is opposed. If you're a person of faith today, that's where things began for us. But secondly today, God's King is crowned. What does God do with this opposition? Well, he laughs. He mocks. He's not sadistic here, okay? It's not a cruel delighting in punishment that we see here. But he is angry. He rebukes and terrifies people. Here's a shocking image of God that confronts us. In the New Testament letter James, we read, the book of James, we read that man's anger does not lead to the righteousness of God. We can have a righteous anger as well, but so often our anger is misplaced. But not God's. God is rightly angered when people oppose him, when people harm others who he cares for and are made in his image. He is rightly angry. And we read here that David, who was the one who captured Jerusalem, it was then called Zion. This is the place where God would dwell. Well, in this place, God says, I will set my king. Verse 6, God's voice, I have installed my king on Zion, my holy hill. God said, I have put someone here who's going to put things right. Here is the one I will act through. Zion is what God's city, Jerusalem, is known as in the Old Testament. It's where he dwelt in the temple. It's where his king ruled from with justice. It was expected that this king was to read the law and to lead God's people in it. They were to live by it. It's important we don't jump ahead too quickly. Zion today, or Zionism, means something different. Zion today can be related to the nation state of Israel today. But before we jump there quickly to say that God has got a special interest or is giving it's just fully on the side of Israel in the conflict of Israel and Palestine. Let's not go there without going through Jesus and the New Testament to see this. That through Jesus as King, he tells us to make disciples of all nations, Palestine included. So it is today that you can find people taking refuge in Jesus who are from a Palestinian Muslim background, as well as from an Israeli Jewish background. Messianic Jews, they might call themselves, continuing in this tradition but believing in Jesus. But let me also suggest that you would find people in opposition to Jesus today, not only in the Palestinian side but on the Jewish side as well. So it looks different now we've moved through Jesus. Yet, let me also just draw out a difference. Currently, Israel is very much the force and the power that is seen to be acting, well, heavy-handedly is putting it mildly, isn't it really, at the moment? But when we read the Old Testament, we need to remember that God's people, Israel, were not the world superpower. They were anything but for most of their history. They actually looked around them to other nations for strength sometimes rather than to God. They allied with others, and then they are exiled among the nations. So these words come to people who feel small, and God is saying, I am king. My king is in place. I am at work, and it's to give them confidence. That's a different place than we are today. This is a different picture of God today than most people are used to. God today for others might be just distant, or maybe he's what Adrian Plass calls God as a senile old man. Let me give you this poem as an illustration. Hello, this is God, speak up. Hello, what's that you say? Well, if you say you did, you did. I didn't hear you pray. You say you asked me several times. Well, nowadays I find that even quite important things just seem to slip my mind. Kind of funny, isn't it? But like, God is a weak old man. I wonder what kind of confidence you have today that in Jesus God has established a kingdom that will not be shifted, will not be stopped, even when it's opposed. Are we living like we're under the care of a senile old man or a mighty king? God's king is crowned, and then God's king will rule, verses 7 to 9. Here is the decree with which he rules, with the job description given by God with authority, and here is the king who speaks. He is son, which means he's been given authority. He is that family likeness to show God, to be merciful and righteous as God was, to be lead by example, to be that ideal. The kings of the other nations were known as gods, but they're just human. So were Israel's kings. As we read through the story of God's people, they were let down so much of the time. Yet there was a greater king who was coming, Jesus. Jesus, who we read in Mark's Gospel, is the Christ. I'll try not to steal too much of Adam's thunder from next week, but he's introduced there right at the beginning. He is the Christ. And all the Gospel writers point to this, and he's also God's Son, not just the Son of a Father as we understand it, but when you hear God's Son, think of royalty as well. So when you hear, next week I'm going there, baptism, this is my Son with whom I'm well pleased. When you hear that being spoken over Jesus, when you see the Spirit come on Jesus and him being anointed with that, there's almost a coronation there at Jesus' baptism. He is my son. Title used of a king. He is my king, God is saying over Jesus. Israel's king was to show God's kingdom to the nations. God's people were to live in a way that won the nations to him. But they never reach that, do they? They fail. It's only when Jesus comes that the gospel goes out to all nations, to the ends of the earth. And we read this in verse 9. We read of the strong rule of the king, who with an iron scepter dashes nations to pieces. And the first impression to us might be of someone who's oppressive, a dictator almost. This rod of iron. Looks all very nice here. Part of the reason that I said it might not be the best idea to look across to the kingdom in the United Kingdom is that it's full of maybe pageantry rather than power. But if you can see at the front here, this is a scepter, which is really a rod of power. It's to show authority. And it could come from that idea of a shepherd who is a ruler and leader and has that rod. David himself was a shepherd, wasn't he? Literally, but also he's to shepherd God's people, and he has a rod. Let me illustrate it like this. As a shepherd, what's the rod used for? The rod protects. It protects from enemies. David himself said that when he faced Goliath, that he'd killed bears and lions with his hands. Sometimes we think of a shepherd as a soft thing. A shepherd's hands were no soft hands like my hands. They were tough. To be a tender shepherd was to be tough as well. And so the rod was used for enemies to give protection to the sheep. Yet it was also used for the sheep to keep them in line, to keep them from straying off. And so God's rule in our lives protects us as one of his people. That iron rod is comfort for us. Comfort? Yes, because he won't let you stray off and do yourself harm. He saves us from ourselves sometimes. He disciplines us, even when we're fighting against him. He breaks us and he brings us back. And he also protects us. Maybe I can apply by hearing the question you have there. Can I trust someone with that kind of power? How can I trust that power? Remember, the shepherd who is our king is the good shepherd who laid down his life for the sheep. Then finally this morning we have this call, this voice that says, get on the right side of God's king. You need to kiss his hand, like we see in the picture here, or give him fealty, or give him allegiance. You're saying, you're my king. Serve him with fear, we read. Kiss the Son. Here is a picture of a mighty warrior king. There's danger if we go up against him. But maybe today you say, or you hear others say, I'm not against God, I just leave him be and he leaves me be. Yeah, let me take you to the story of the prodigal for a moment. Or the story of two sons. We'll focus on the younger one that Jesus told. The younger son says to his father, give me what I want now. Give me my share of the inheritance. And he goes off to spend it. And yet as he does that, he's really saying to his father, I care more about what I get from you than you. I don't really care if you're dead. In fact, give me my money now. When we live apart from God, when we just live for taking all the good things he's given us, it's the same kind of insult that we give him. We disrespect him. When we don't give him his rightful place in our lives, we are taking him head on. It mightn't feel like it, but we're saying, I want to live my way, not your way. And yet there's a different picture here at the end. Did you get it? Blessed are all who take refuge in him. An echo of Psalm 1. Blessed are those who live God's way. When we give him allegiance, when we follow his ways and his words, there's a refuge and a blessing. Let me illustrate it like this. At the moment, we're back into rugby season. There's lots of rugby on TV. Now, rugby players at the minute are getting bigger and bigger. They are really big, and they collide into each other. But last week in Ireland's win against France away, Joe McCarthy was the player of the match. And he's called Big Joe McCarthy. Now, all the rugby players are pretty big, but he's that bit bigger again. And it makes a difference what side of Joe McCarthy you're on. If you're in the Ireland team, you love that he is big because he's aggressive, he's going through people, he's getting yards forward, and you're behind Joe McCarthy. You're behind him because you're able to run through the gaps. He's going out front and you're behind him. And you feel strong because of that. If you were France last week, you had Big Joe McCarthy coming at you. It was head on. And it was a very different story. Now that's a story about a slightly bigger than other big rugby players player. Imagine the difference when we take head on the Almighty God and powerful King Jesus. Imagine the difference when we stand behind him, when we have safety in him. Today, hear the call of this psalm to see the big picture. No matter how uncertain your life might be, no matter how much it might feel like things are against you, have confidence that God is at work to extend the kingdom of his Son Jesus. No matter what fears and worries are at the front of our mind, step back and see there's no safer place to be than on Jesus' side. The big picture, yes, and the better story. So much of the call to us today in our culture is to look inside for meaning, to look inside for strength, to look inside for safety. It's all on me. And yet, our world becomes smaller and smaller. We become disconnected from others and from God. It's all about me. Yet here in the good news of Jesus is a call to think bigger, to see that we are part of his kingdom, yes, but that kingdom involves others. It involves people across the world today. It involves people across history today. And we are part of that. And that kingdom is not all about me. It's all about Jesus. And yet we get to be part of it. It's in this that we have security, that we have meaning, and that we have joy. We're part of a bigger picture and a better story in Jesus.